Most companies these days are pursuing some sort of strategy to make sure that they're being more socially responsible or being more sustainable. But how can you be truly responsible if your suppliers, the raw material producers, the component providers, the transportation and logistic services that make up your supply chain, if they aren't? Today's companies have hundreds of suppliers, and the supply chain can typically account between 50 and 70% of both total expenses and greenhouse gas emissions for most manufacturing operations. Supply chains are therefore critical to ensuring greater organizational sustainability. Let's talk about how organizations can turbocharge their sustainability performance by focusing more on responsible and sustainable supply chains. When we talk about supply chain sustainability, we're talking primarily about the management of environmental, social, and economic impacts, and the encouragement of good governance practices throughout the life cycle of the goods and services. In today's world, outsourcing business operations is becoming more and more common. But this doesn't mean that we can outsource the responsibility of our risks just because it's in our supply chain. Most companies recognize that a sustainable supply chain is not just an optional nice to have. It's a business imperative, which is critical to the success of the organization as a whole. In a recent study, the UN Global Compact recorded that 96% of CEOs asserted that sustainability should be integrated into all aspects of strategy and operations. And 88% of them singled out the supply chain as an area of specific importance. It's not very surprising then that companies are investing more resources in these areas and developing specific supplier codes of conduct to govern their relationships with their global suppliers in order to mitigate any risks and enhance their own social responsibility performance. While the challenges of implementing a sustainable supply chain management process can seem a bit daunting at first, companies that have allocated appropriate time and resources to these activities have reported a number of business benefits. And these benefits include realizing greater efficiencies, mostly related to reducing costs of material inputs and increasing labor productivity. Also those of managing business risks more effectively, such as those related to business disruption and mitigating possible reputational damage. And also that of harnessing their supply chain's ability to innovate and work more collaboratively with each other in order to create more sustainable products. If these benefits aren't sufficiently convincing, there's also the fact that regulatory pressures around supply chains continue to increase, increasing the regulatory and compliance risk for companies with threats of sanctions and fines for non-compliant companies. The emerging regulatory framework related to environmental, social, and governance issues in the supply chains includes, among others, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act of 2010, the U.S. Federal Acquisitions Regulations on combating trafficking in persons, the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, the UK and Australian Modern Slavery Act, the U.S. Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, the EU Financial Disclosure Act, France's most recent Corporate Duty of Vigilance Law, as well as conflict minerals regulation in the EU, the Dodd-Frank Act in the US, and national regulatory frameworks for reducing GHG emissions in supply chains. And of course, anti-bribery legislation around the world, like the FCPA and the UK Bribery Act, which these extend also to the company supply chain. So it's clear there's a real push to focus more on supply chain sustainability. And indeed, some of you may have already begun to implement a program for your organization and just want to find out how to improve upon it. If this describes your organization, I'd encourage you to use our free online assessment tool available on our website. This diagnostic tool that we've created is based on a number of recognized standards, international best practice, as well as our own experience. And it'll help you determine just how sustainable your supply chain currently is, and perhaps more importantly, what you can do to improve it further. I'll also put a link to the tool at the end of this video in the description box so you can access it there. For others who may just be starting out or are looking to how they can move their approach from maybe a more ad hoc approach to one that's a little bit more systematic, we've created another video to complement this one, in which I'll share with you some practical steps of how to get started and maintain a sustainable supply chain management system for your organization. And you can access that video by clicking on the cards above. While more and more companies are seeking to expand their sustainability programs to include suppliers, they sometimes struggle with implementation. Hopefully these resources will be useful for you and your organization and help it move towards a more sustainable supply chain. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our video channel for more sustainability-related tips and updates for your organization.